Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
Good to see you as always. Welcome everyone to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two therapists talk about modern relationships. Today, Matt, we're going to talk about the idea that relationships don't need to be safe spaces. This idea of safe spaces that has really dominated conversation about therapy, about relationships, about all sorts of connections in the world over the last decade or so. There was one sentence I wanted to start us off with in our recent
Mm,
blog post for Psychology Today that we wrote on this subject, that relationships are not meant to be low conflict, they're meant to be high repair, or at least good relationships should be. Talk us through the kind of principles of that statement, because I think that kind of sums up where we're coming to this subject from.
yeah. I think that is the heart of it, isn't it? I think that's to jump straight to the conclusion. I think maybe like 20 seconds on just how embedded that idea of the
Yeah,
safe
good.
space
Yeah.
is. That we're really worried about raised voices, aren't we? That's the thing I come across a lot. That's what sort of gets us to that conclusion that people really fear the conflict and they fear arguments. And I think what we're saying, which is maybe a little different from what other therapists might say, or other so-called relationship experts might say, is that we're really not worried about that. Like that's okay as long as that's done in a particular way. The argument and the conflict really is it's grist for the mill. It's like that's the good stuff as well. So where we get to in terms of that conclusion, actually the thing is, how do you repair when you have disagreed or when you find a point of conflict that you can't settle? Like how do you deal with that? That's really the key. The fact that you fall into conflict, that you see things differently, that you view the world through two quite different lenses, that's inevitable, and we can all chill about that.
Yeah, there's a bit of avoidance in the idea of safe spaces, isn't there? There's an
Yeah.
avoidance of difference. There's an avoidance of confronting difficult, spiky issues between
Yeah.
us, which I think
Yeah.
is pacifying in a certain way and a little bit immature, a little bit infantile at times
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
agreed. Yeah. And so we say something like the most resilient couples we know would argue about a whole load of things, and the things that maybe matter most or great most in a relationship, when and how frequently you have sex, how you spend money, and if you've got kids, like those parenting choices, those really
Yeah.
show up your differences and your disagreements. They really reveal your values. And the most resilient couples are not those who decide not to argue about those things, never talk about them, or I don't know, bury their head. I don't really know what the alternative would be. You've got to go to it, haven't you? You've got to step into those conflicts, but the way and the manner in which you do that is the I guess is the kicker.
I guess we often see relationships where couples might have got together, for example, in their mid to late 20s, might not have had to confront those issues in the lovely halcyon early days of the relationship
Mm,
where it's all
mm,
about getting to know each other and have fun together. And then all of a sudden you're in your mid 30s, late 30s, potentially
yeah.
thinking about mortgages, thinking about children. It's easier to avoid those subjects until they reach
Yes.
fruition often,
Yes.
isn't
Yes.
it? And
Yeah.
then
You're right. Yeah.
sometimes it can be too late. So
Yeah. It is. I think it's also. It feels like failure, doesn't it? I think you're dead right on that point. That you might have left some of that stuff. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say too late, as in
yes,
it's not fatal, but you've
yes.
left it quite late, and now you're going to need to put something sort of a bit more like a plan in place to fix that up. Right? You have got to tackle those things. I think if you then want a successful relationship going forward, and to some extent, even if you separate, where there are shared finances and certainly shared children, you can continue that argument for decades if you don't do something about that. But I guess it's also the idea behind or the fear behind that when I talk to couples is that the conflict itself is evidence of a failure, that it's gone wrong. And I'm like, why would we make that assumption? Why would two people getting together have exactly the same view on those things? Why wouldn't we disagree? Why wouldn't we have a
Yeah,
genuine
can we talk about the words that we're using? So
yeah,
when people hear conflict, I think
yeah,
they think raised voices. So
uh-huh,
let's
yeah,
kind of tease out and pass out kind of what we're talking about,
yeah,
because I think in relationships, when we say to people conflict is good, disagreement is good,
Yeah,
they often imagine couples shouting and screaming at each other and slam
yeah,
doors, etc.,
yeah, yeah.
and storming. We're not talking about that. We're talking
No, no, you're dead right to point that out too, aren't you? Yeah, tell us what you think.
disagreement is fundamentally different to big rows. We're talking about it's inevitable when two people get together and share a life together that their
Yep,
values differ in important ways, that their personalities differ in important ways, that even some of the really boring day-to-day stuff like how tidy you want the house
exactly.
to be are going to
Yeah,
differ. And unless you confront those, even though again the word confront makes it sound like there's a heavy conflict in there,
yeah,
but
yeah,
approach those issues and learn how to talk about and live with and move through those issues together.
yeah,
At some point the resentment is going to grow. At some point it's going to explode instead
yeah.
of being a grown-up mature conversation about those things. And that's what we're advocating, not that you occasionally have a Friday night blowout where there's shouting and slam doors.
No, definitely not. Well worth clarifying that, isn't it? That's absolutely not what I'm talking about. I think those things are by and large off limits. I think they are destructive to a relationship, and I wouldn't hang around for too long in a relationship that was like that and could only talk about disagreements in that way, sulking, seething, withdrawing, slamming doors,
Yeah,
shouting, threats of separation,
yeah.
any of those sort of contemptuous, kind of somewhat aggressive behaviors. But what we are saying is you've got to go to that disagreement. So the parenting ones are maybe on our mind given where we are in life. But I talk to lots of couples about these things. And like it's really to kind of humdrum prosaic stuff. Do you want your kids in competitive sports? Like for one person, that really, really matters. They see the value of it. It kind of mirrors their own childhood. They engage with all of what they got from those activities, like the pain of it, the lessons they learned, the joy that they got from it. And from the other person, sports are irrelevant or annoying or just something that caused them upset, and they really don't want that experience for their kids. So like just tiny stuff that you could probably never anticipate, be
Mm.
hard to get in front of some of those things. They're gonna come up. And then we've got to say why that's important to us. I guess that's what I mean by conflict. We have got a very, very different point of view, and nobody is absolutely obviously right, and nobody is absolutely obviously wrong. The person who doesn't like, in that example, competitive sports because it hurt them to be picked last, or they just didn't enjoy getting knocked about, or they felt incompetent at it, or whatever else, they've got a point of view, haven't they? They've got something that they need to bring to the table and represent. And the person who values that has got to speak up for their value. And I think it's easy to do that or easy to describe that process. It's quite hard to do. And it's quite hard to do if you've not seen it modeled. I'm going to say what I want. I'm going to say it in a concise way. I'm going to say it without giving a lecture. And then I'm going to stop and I'm going to wait for my partner to respond to see if they can acknowledge that, to see if there's anything they want to build on, to see if there's anything they want to challenge back on. So, really simple sort of set of tools, but actually very difficult to do if you've not done it in previous relationships, you've not seen it modeled in the family you grew up in. That I think is sort of roughly how I would see conflict management playing out, that we're listening, that we're agreeing with what we can, we're acknowledging the other person's point of view, we're building where we can, or we're pushing back where we think, actually, I want to challenge on this. Something about this doesn't feel right for me.
There's maybe an additional element of that, which is dealing with not getting your own way as well at
Yep.
the back
Yep.
end of that conversation in an adult way. Part of our broader experience of this subject, or our broader thinking around this, is that conflict in the workplace maybe as well has become
Yeah.
something to avoid more frequently in
Agreed.
recent decades, and that maybe people aren't having the experiences in the workplace that then they can take back to their relationships of how do I advocate for my point of view, how do I talk from a position of authority and assertiveness, but
Yeah.
then when things don't go my way I can back off and I can just deal with that and move on with the next thing.
Yeah.
That they're almost having experiences of everyone tiptoeing around a subject at work, and then they're doing the exact same thing when they get back home. And I think what we're trying to do is to really emphasize and encourage people to step into that space at home, even if they don't feel like they can do that at work. And I think that is the reality for a lot of people these days in the workplace, is that they feel very cautious about disagreeing, particularly with senior people in an organization.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. We touch on that a little bit in the article, don't we? I think having said that the disagreement is easy, I mean, sort of easier at conceptual level, it's very, very difficult to do. And I think it creates a discomfort in us because I don't think we're typically doing that work. You don't argue back with your key clients. You do what they've asked you to do, and you often we pre-meet, don't we? We try and get everything lined up beforehand. We keep things sanitized. We don't often go about having a genuine disagreement. My son's having some surgery next week, and what was really interesting was seeing the consultant surgeon who's doing the operation talk with the other medical specialist who's doing a series of manual manipulations, which might mean that he needs to either have no surgery or a sort of lesser version of the surgery. And because it's the NHS and we're not, paying to go privately, you just see the NHS in action, and they haven't done a pre-meet. So we're in the room with them, my son as well, and they're somewhat disagreeing. And it's sort of refreshing and interesting to see, but it also is striking me
Not
as
very reassuring though.
somebody's been in a more sort of corporate setting that this is unusual. This
Yeah.
feels almost unprofessional. Like there's a clear disagreement between them.
Yeah.
And so, there's a positive to that, isn't there? But there's also, well, we're going to have to work this out. There's a series of other appointments and people waiting. So, like, we've probably only got like 15 minutes or so for us to come to a settled conclusion, for the parents to get an input, and for us to sign a form saying we're going to do the two-stage surgery or the first phase of the surgery, or we're going to pause and wait and see whether actually we want surgery in another 3 to 6 months' time.
Mm, mm.
So those sort of situations, I think, in a relationship, they do feel like we're going into this with a degree of uncertainty. I want to speak up for something that's really important to me, and I think you're not going to be able to see my point of view. So maybe I avoid this, or maybe I come in really strong, or maybe I try and mount a really long, complicated argument to mean that I, win the day or prevail. Whereas I think we're trying to come in with I've got this really important point of view that I want to share with you. I don't think you're going to agree in the first instance, but can you listen to what I'm saying? And then can I try and hear back what the objections are, where there are
Yeah.
points of agreement? Can we shape something and work it through? And I think that's the bit of relationships which is just not talked about at all.
You're in danger, I think, of making it sound a bit too easy, in the sense
Yeah, sure.
making it sound like the person on the receiving end is coming in with the same attitude and the same set of
Yeah,
skills.
yeah,
In my experience, that's unlikely to be the case. The person who's advocating for themselves and taking a risk in saying what they want and moving into that more vulnerable place is often met with defensiveness or pushback or persuasion as to why they're wrong. What would you advocate that person to do in terms of raising the stakes a little bit and
yeah.
taking further risks in that way? What have you seen
It's
work
a,
in the couples room? Put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, in couples therapy, it's why I quite like doing couples therapy, and although I like talking to individuals about their relationship a lot and do that a lot as well, I quite like having everybody in the room, right? Because we have got to agree some ground rules, I think, on those things. I think we do need some agreement. I mean, I'm not imposing my model of the of how conflict should be resolved or my view of the world on people, but I am sharing something which seems to work on average with most
Most
people.
people don't. Most couples don't have you in the room with them to help them in those moments, though, Matt. Do they?
Well, I think that's the challenge. I mean, I think that is why it goes wrong, because we're not bringing something which feels like, okay, how do we resolve this? Just good negotiation strategies or tactics or mental models or whatever it might be. I think we're not great at negotiations. I'm also in the process of selling a house at the moment, and it's quite hard to do business with people. It's quite hard to be sensible and get to an agreement which gives something to both sides. Like people's negotiation strategy is still to go in very high or low or chip you at a certain point in the process. And it's like, this is not how negotiation gets done at a professional level. If you read anything about negotiation, it's not go in really hard, stick to a predetermined position and don't move at all costs. The negotiation advice is really very different from that. It's trying to agree on ideals or values or principles and then see what you can do and accept, almost inevitably accept some bit of loss within that process. So I don't quite know what the answer is. I mean, more couples therapy, right? But I think if your partner is not going into that in a way that is receiving that conversation as genuine and open, you're in quite a bit of trouble, I think.
Well, I think there are certain principles that might help. One of which is, I know it's a kind of trite point, but you're talking about yourself rather than the other person.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even if you're talking about kind of conditions of the house, you're talking about your own principles of
Right.
cleanliness. If you
Yeah.
make the other person feel like you're telling them that they're a dirty, slovenly pig, then it's not going
Yeah.
to work. There's something there
So
about
those kind of I statements that I feel
yeah,
this way. When
exactly.
you do that, I feel this way. Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, the kind of classic stuff. Then there's something about your values, isn't there? That it's only going to resonate with someone if it's meaningful to you. Like, why is this important to you? So if you're
Mm.
talking about parenting, it's not, you're not necessarily saying the evidence shows that my approach works and your approach doesn't. It's more a values-based conversation about the sort of family you want, the sort of
Yeah.
children you want to bring
Yeah.
up, the values of your household. Then you can have a broader conversation about what you're talking about. So even if it's talking about how frequently you have sex, right? It might be a broader conversation about what sort of sex life you both want. What sort of household do you want? What sort of children do you want to bring up? You're potentially opening a door to a broader conversation, I think, with any conflict. It's rarely about that one more
Yeah.
direct minor point you're going into the conflict with, I think. And just going in
Yeah.
with that mindset of actually, we might be talking about something bigger than this, I think can be helpful for couples.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. It's a sort of opposite of read this article and see why I'm right, or listen
Yeah.
to the podcast and then you'll realize what I've been saying all along.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of
Yeah.
passag swapping of stuff online, right?
Yeah, you're not persuading, right? You're not
Yeah,
seeking to persuade. You're seeking to help someone understand why something is important to
yeah,
you, and then hopefully they move in your direction, but they might not. And then it's about, okay, well, they haven't moved on that, but are they open to moving on some other stuff? But if they're completely immovable on everything, then you've got to start questioning the dynamic of the relationship, right? But either by going into couples therapy or getting out of that relationship. Because if you're in a relationship where genuinely someone's listening to statements about how important things are to you from a values-based place and just ignoring that or dismissing it, then you've got to
yeah.
question why you're with that person, I think.
Yeah, so the notion of trade-offs there, and I suppose also in terms of some of the practical suggestions you were making, sometimes I'm saying, could we trial it? You know, could we trial it one way, and then could we trial it another way, or could we trial it one way and just see how that goes, and then make moderations to that. In abstract, you can adopt a position, can't you? A kind of hill to die on, and it can get a bit stuck. And sometimes, okay, if we're talking about taking the kid along to some kind of sporting activity, should we give it a whirl? You know, see if they.
Sometimes, yeah, I like that. I like that. I think another thing I'd want people to reflect upon is that sometimes you're talking about personality differences that are genuinely hard to change. That I think from the other side of the net, it can feel like someone's just being almost deliberately obtuse in not changing.
Yeah,
So something like cleanliness or orderliness, we know that that can be quite a deep personality trait. Like some people are much more that way inclined to order their life, to structure their life, to be on time, to have things in the diary. And other people simply aren't. Yeah, you can try and work to change that part of your personality. But I think sometimes that can feel like a deliberate slight rather than something that is a fundamental difference, that it's going to take quite a lot of work for your partner to move towards you.
yeah,
And that doesn't mean that they're not trying when they kind of leave their clothes on the floor again the next night or whatever. It's not a signal that they aren't listening to you and don't give a shit about you. It
yeah,
can be that they're trying quite hard, but they've
yeah.
just dropped the ball again.
Not to take it so personally and to accept some of that difference, even when the accepting it is not, oh, it's charming or I love it or I
No,
found it up. So I just
no.
like, this is kind of annoying. This is an
And
annoying.
no problem with pointing it out again. No problem with
Sure.
saying, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. I just want you to know that I found that quite difficult. I'm not
Yeah.
going to give you a hard time about it, but
Yeah.
can you try hard again tomorrow?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And sometimes like that sounds easy, and sometimes those things go really well. So I suppose to speak up for some of those models and for some of what we're doing in therapy, sometimes those are game changing ideas, that the other person would then receive that and be like, yeah, that felt different from the previous times where I felt kind of scolded or belittled
Yes.
or told off about that. And actually that's fair, I have done it again, and we don't need to have like, I'm when couples are talking about those things, I'm like, it's 30 seconds
Yeah.
sometimes. I don't mean 20 minutes, and I definitely don't mean 2 hours. I'm just like, say the thing, say what you want, say why it mattered to you, stop, give the other person a chance to respond. And sometimes the response is much better than you'd expect. Maybe we come back to that idea of anti-fragile that we talk about a lot, I guess, across the pieces that we write.
Yeah,
We talk
almost that we're
about it here.
that we're advocating that this is not just neutral in a relationship, not just important, but actually helps relationships grow. Say a little bit about that. You
Yeah, so I mean, you've summed it up quite well there. It's not just that these things are inevitable, necessary, or a compromise. But like, the idea of something being anti-fragile suggests that it actually benefits from stress or from a shock to the system. So the classic example is muscles and bones that require being stretched and strained and stressed and knocked in order to grow stronger. And there's a bit of repair as well, isn't there, with muscles, which is quite an interesting, link maybe to the idea you were talking about up front, that we need to repair things, but that muscles actually, the bones grow through impact. You increase your bone density
Mm.
through impacting your bones, not jumping from the 20th floor, but actually doing repetitive exercise or activity that to some extent strains, shocks, impacts them, and that relationships work in the same way. That if you go to that conflict, if you begin to resolve that conflict, if you begin to take lessons from what went wrong when you tried to resolve it that time before, and you do something differently, and you keep at it and you keep at it, it is a little bit like exercise. You will, in time, increase the muscle mass of your relationship, the bone density of your relationship, your collective VO2 max, or whatever it is. Actually, you're doing something really
What
useful and
if you take
significant.
that analogy to a relationship, what is it that you're strengthening? You're strengthening what? The trust that you can assert what you need in the relationship, the trust that your partner is going to care about your feelings, the trust that you can get through that to the other side, even if you fundamentally disagree and argue about
Yeah,
something and there's no
yeah,
consensus there. Because I think that's
yeah,
a big thing that couples worry about is if we raise this, so take the issue of children,
yeah,
if we raise that I want children and he probably doesn't want
yeah,
children, we're going to have to confront the fact that there's this big elephant in the room in our relationship that we can't get through.
yeah,
And I think what you're saying is that if you've done enough work to prove that you can get through a lot together in terms of
exactly.
disagreeing and personality differences, you can probably get through this as well. You can find a way through it. That
Yeah,
it might
yeah,
be something
yeah.
ultimately that you have to end the relationship about, but chances are you'll be able to find some way through it.
Yeah, I mean, we've taken an edge case, haven't we? There, we've
Well,
taken like
yeah,
the
yeah.
hardest,
Yes,
the hardest
yes, yes,
example. But I think
yeah,
even in your can't get through it scenario, you might can't get through it in a way that is like dignified, and you don't
yeah,
trash each other,
exactly.
and you don't say
Exactly.
what a useless,
Yeah.
so the other one is, and that
And you
you,
don't waste 20 years of marriage
yeah,
wishing that you'd had children. Yeah.
sure, exactly right. And you might be able to trade off and compromise, particularly if you took like a less difficult case where you could trial something for a while. And with sports, it's probably not taking the kid along once. It's probably signing them up to a term or a season and seeing how they get on. And then the other person who's less sold on the idea is also supportive and is also taking them there, rather than, well, if you want them to go, you take them. That isn't what we're getting to. That isn't the trade-off, right? That isn't the negotiation. That isn't the compromise. It's just you kind of sticking to a position and being probably something like passive aggressive. The trade-off is, sure, let's do it alternately. I'll keep with the messaging. I'll understand why this is important to you.
Mm.
Where I'm thinking, actually, we need to stop. This is making everyone in the house miserable. I'll come back to you, that we can keep going over this. That's the sort of confidence I think you might be building, that kind of idea that we're not fragile. This isn't going to fall apart. It wasn't terrible. I'm not going to tell you you were wrong about this. I'm just going
Yeah.
to come back and say, look, do you mind if we go over this again? Because I really don't think they're enjoying it. I think it's disruptive to other parts of family life, it gets on my nerves. The traffic is hell. There's nowhere to park. I think this is diminishing returns. And then the other person can say, I agree. I got that wrong. Can we try it for another couple of weeks? Can we still push through to the end of the term? I would like us to complete it. We've paid the fee, whatever else. And you might or might not agree in the first instance on that. You might end up going around the track. The reason I think it's okay to go around the track again on that is because it wasn't awful, right? We both respected one another's point of view. You're right about the parking. You're right, they're not enjoying it at the moment. I think if we push through and they develop their skills and they get more embedded in the team, they might then, we can just do that forever, can't we? In a way that is, I don't know, it's almost nourishing rather than not too bad. It is a positive. I think you do get that sense that we're listening to one another, we're hearing, we can do this.
Even as you're talking about that back and forth, I imagine a lot of people would take that quite personally. And I think that's
Sure.
another
Yeah,
principle, isn't it? Is that
yeah,
those conversations are rarely personal.
yeah, yeah,
I was also thinking about corporations and businesses again while you were talking, and the
yeah,
anti-fragile point, that I think it's so healthy for an organization to be able to withstand internal criticism and challenge.
sure.
And I think we have both worked in organizations and parts of organizations where that hasn't been the case. And I
Yeah,
think there have been weaker organizations making worse decisions as a result, that everyone's nodding their head in agreement and walking out of those meetings saying, oh, I can't believe we made that decision. I can't believe no one raised this point.
yeah.
And you don't want to be in a relationship that mimics that, really. You don't want to be in a relationship where you're going to bed at night and you're both laying your head on the pillows thinking, I wish we had that conversation, but neither of us dared to have it.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a bit of time, doesn't it? In a sort of in an organizational setting, there'd be a kind of management overhead. Like that's a longer meeting. That's two meetings rather than one. We haven't pre-wired it, and it's not sort of strongest person wins. It's not this is what the director wants, etc. It's genuinely like all voices can be heard, and nothing's off the table. It's a different way of doing things, and I guess in a relationship you're making some space for that, aren't you? I think the other thing we'd say on a different day is like maybe don't have that conversation at 10:30 in the evening when you're about to go to bed. Like think about when you're going to have this disagreement. If you want to raise something that's important and you want your partner's attention, you want their eyes on it, there is a better and worse time to do that. I'm not saying like wait forever for an optimum time, because often in a relationship where you're working there isn't that much time. Family life complicates things further, but there might be a moment where you are having coffee together and that is a good moment to raise it, and maybe just before bedtime for the children is entirely the wrong time to raise it. So there's a bit of thoughtfulness around this as well, isn't
I
there?
agree with that strongly. I often advocate for I know it can feel again a bit trite and a bit formulaic, but having a weekly conversation, a
Yeah,
weekly
sure.
point where you talk about your lives, you combine that with a bit of a logistical conversation. If you do have the kids and the dogs and the other pets to
Yeah,
organize during the week, combining that with how are things, anything you want to talk about, conversation
yeah,
can be helpful. Just
yeah.
uh, just before we finish, you often talk about the common trope of not arguing in front of the kids.
Mm,
And how would you advocate we and couples kind of balance the it's important to show kids how to have healthy conflict and repair, but not almost doing what you were almost just advocating for, which is kind of find these pockets of more sensible time over coffee where you can
yeah.
talk about these things. You kind of want to expose in the family life, you want to expose the energy of conflict and the importance and values of conflict, but you want to do it in a healthy way. How do you do it, for example, in your household? Maybe let's start there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think it depends what you're talking about, and it depends where you think you are on this or continuum of skill and comfort with this. So for some couples, I see it's like maybe do this in the most optimum way. You wouldn't learn to swim in the open sea, right? So like do this in public if that keeps your behavior in check. Do it over a hot drink, because there's a sort of duration of time, isn't there? 20 minutes or half an hour to have a cup of tea or coffee before it's sort of gone cold, and that would be that, right? So sort of a bit of starting relatively small. You're still going at it, you're going at it with a bit of attack, but you're not doing something which is going to trip you up. So I think in those instances, maybe that doesn't get played out in front of the kids. I think there's some things my wife and I would talk about behind closed doors, which is a bit more
Yeah.
contentious, or we know it trips us up. Most of the stuff I'm happy for the boys to overhear, because I think we've got to a point where we can have those discussions. We sort of are in agreement on what the ground rules are, and we know that we've done it like many times before. So the confidence doesn't come from being a therapist, or having reached a certain age or point in life. It's more like, I know we have done that thing. We've done it any number of times. So a bit like taking a penalty or something, there is pressure, but you've done it a lot of times. You've done it in game situations. You do it all the time in training, and you know you're going bottom right or bottom left, and there's a probability that it could go right as well as go wrong. It could go wrong, but then we would know in that situation, if I was talking about my house, that this is time to stop it. Okay, we're not
Yeah.
actually getting anywhere with
Yeah.
this one, and we've been round the track for like 10 minutes or so, and like that's more than enough on this.
Go
Let's
your separate ways.
yeah. But not again, to state the obvious, I suppose, not in a sulky way, not turning the radio up, not putting not disappearing into headphones or whatever if you're in the
Yeah.
car.
Not cursing under your breath.
Yeah, exactly. That we can, and also like we could be a bit irritated with the other person. That's, I think, some of the idea of anti-fragile, or that repair
Yeah.
is okay. That's like, oh my God, you're not listening to him. I'm just not. I'm trying to make this point, and you seem unable to hear this point. Like that would be an okay level of frustration, I think, in my house. Beyond that, I'd be a bit wary of it. If there's any sort of criticism or contempt creeping in, I think you and I would both say, let's be careful with that. Oh, you're always like this, or you never
Totally.
listen, or
Totally.
why can't you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Those things start to feel rude. Would you do that to a preferred client? Would you do that in a professional setting? If the answer is no, don't do it in your
No,
relationship.
and I think there's just coming back full circle, the idea that relationships are safe spaces, the idea that you should be able to some degree to feel safe enough to express anything, I think is one of those contemporary ideas that we need to continue to challenge.
Yeah, I agree. And the final point, maybe I'd raise just quickly before we close, is that if you don't do this, if you don't step into conflict and disagreement, it's not that you preserve harmony, it's that you make things like boring and stuck, and the relationship has no edge. You can't say what's important to you. You can't be yourself. You can't raise things that really matter. And in the end, that will trip you up. Like someone will leave, somebody will exit the relationship, either physically or just in a kind of more metaphorical way. Like they're not interested in you anymore. They don't want to turn in and get comfort from you. They don't want to give you anything. Like you're no use to them over time. They just do their own thing. They keep it in. They don't share. And I think that's the bit that's really destructive. One, it can get boring and samey. Two, that you take your own counsel. You don't really use the other person in any kind of way, shape, or form to do your problem solving or to share things that are important to you. And three, you exit because somebody else is much more attractive to you, or listens to you, or understands you. So I think there's a real risk in not doing it. So it's a bit of short-term pain, I think, when you step into those conflicts, bit like the gym, bit like eating well, bit like anything, short-term pain for a more medium, long-term gain.
Good. Let's leave it there and we can
That rousing finale.
rousing finale. And then once we've pressed stop on the record, you and I can have our weekly relationship conversation out of earshot of our listeners, because I don't think they're ready to hear that yet.
I relish it.
Good. Good to see you, Matt.
Take care.
See you next time. Bye for now.